So let's start off by selecting the picture frame so we get the material accessible, and we'll drag in a texture. So I'm going to use a wood texture from Texture Haven, same place we got the HDRI image from, the world environment, and it's going to be one called Plywood. So I'm going to drag this in and I'll plug it into the base color. And again, you can find the same texture in the tutorial files. So it's applied the texture now to the 3D geometry, but we've not yet controlled how it places the texture. So I want it to go, the grain, to follow the frame all the way around, whereas at the moment on these side parts, it's going horizontally, which I don't want. Before we start actually doing it, I want to explain how it works. And what I'm about to show you isn't the way we're actually going to be doing it. This is entirely for demonstration purposes only, so you don't need to follow along with this bit. So I'm going to create a new object. We'll do Shift A, I'll make it a plane. I'll just isolate this now, so go into isolation mode, and we'll go into edit mode. I'll right click and I'll choose subdivide. I'll repeat that with Shift R so we get a few subdivisions. We'll come back out of edit mode, and in the right hand side, in the data panel for this geometry, we've got something called shape keys. So shape keys, you can record different states of an object. So I'm going to create a base. This is the current sort of initial state that it's in now. And I'll create another one. And this is going to be the shape I'm going to use to demonstrate how it works. So I'll call this screwed up. So I'll go back into edit mode, making sure I've got the screwed up shape key selected. I'll turn on proportional editing. And I'll just start moving things around to make this 2D geometry into a 3D object. Alright, so now we've got quite a complex geometry. If I come back out of edit mode into object mode, I'll just turn up the value of the shape key so it controls how much in this state it is. So I'll turn that up, and now we've got this 3D geometry which we need to, if we want to lay it over an image. So let me bring in another mesh. We'll pretend this is the image that we're going to transfer the texture from onto the 3D geometry. And I'll give this a material, new material, and I'll stick any old random image into its base color. I'll go with a screenshot of me inside of a big screen VR app. So I'll plug this in to the base color. And now we're going to get an image on there. Right, so I'll just move this out of the way temporarily so we can see that image. And I'm going to go, instead of being in rendered mode in cycles, I'm going to go into material preview, just so it's a little bit easier to see. So we've got this image now on the plane. I want to trace this image onto this 3D object that I've got here. Now, obviously I can't do that while it's in this 3D state. So what I'm going to do, I'll just put this back to where it was. I'll put this back to world center as well. I need to unfold this or unwrap it so that it's flat, and then I can start tracing the image onto it. So with this selected, I'll just start unwrapping it until it's a flat object, and now I can trace the underneath image onto this 3D object because we've flattened it out. If I try to do it here, it's not going to be possible. So this is easy if you've got something like a plane. So let's move that up a bit. So it's easy if it's like a plane because you can very easily unwrap it. But the problem is, what if it's something you can't unwrap? Like, for example, a cylinder. So if I try and flatten this out, it's not possible. So let's see what happens. We'll create a shape key for it. We'll create another one. We'll call this unwrapped. Go into edit mode, and I'm going to try and flatten this down. So I'll set the top one. Number 2, set the bottom one as well. And now I'll scale that down to flatten it out. And it's not possible to flatten it out, as you probably guessed, because obviously we can't flatten it without it overlapping, which sometimes is okay. But generally, you're going to want to make a cut in it and then flatten it out so you can get a unique part of the image to each face on the object. So we'll create another shape key, and I'll call the next one unwrapped after cutting. So what we'll do now is, I'll select this top one. In fact, I'll select these side ones. I'll say P, we'll separate the selection to a new object. I'll choose that object, into edit mode, select both of those faces, by pressing P and choose separate by loose parts, which will make disconnected elements into separate objects. I'll just put these into a container. So I'll select all three. I'll press M, new collection, and I'll put tube. So now we've got a collection over here, so it's easier to see which objects belong to this tube. So I can now rotate each one of these objects until it's flat to the world. I first need to put the origin at the center of each of those new objects so that we can rotate around the correct origin. I'll just select all three of these and I'll give them all their own origin now. So I'll just say set origin, origin to geometry, and now each object has got an origin directly in the middle, and that will allow me to now select these and rotate them around their own origin. So I'll rotate that 90 degrees. Now we can scale that down. We'll do the same with the other one. Rotate it 90 degrees, scale it down, and move it out of the way. So let's just move this out of the way temporarily. And we'll hide this plane. So I'm just going to put this eyeball, turn that off so we can see the image again. Going to top view, I can now take these and put them over the image, the part of the image that I want them to display. It's going to trace whatever's underneath this part of the geometry on the image onto that part of the geometry. Now for the tube, I still can't put this over because it's still one continuous piece. I need to cut it. So I'll go into edit mode and I want to cut along this edge. We'll do F3 and we'll do rip. And then I'll click on the edge that I want to rip. And now if I select this face or this edge, we've now got two. So we've made a cut in the object. And this is going to allow me to flatten it out. Now, just in case you're worried, this is not something you always have to do when you want to apply texture to a geometry. This is purely just for demonstration purposes. When we do it for real, it's all going to be pretty much automatic. This is just to demonstrate how it works. At this point, just imagine some Benny Hill theme tune music playing, because I tried to flatten this mesh out now in the most illogical possible way, but we did get there in the end. Right, so let's see what happens here. If I unwrap that, you can see we've unwrapped it into a flat piece of paper. And now we can go into top view. I can scale this down and then move it over the image to the bits of the image again that I want it to be showing. And that's how UV mapping works. So fortunately, we don't have to do all that manual work. There are sort of built-in functions to unwrap it for us. We just might have to give it a little hand by telling it whereabouts to cut. So with the explanation out of the way, let's get rid of all this stuff we've created. So I'll select all this, I'll just delete it, and we'll get rid of this container up here as well. We don't need that anymore. This collection up there, we don't need that anymore. I'll delete that. We'll come out of isolation mode, which we can tell we're in because it says local just here. So /, and I've got my picture frame back. And we can start applying what we've just learned to get the texture positioned exactly how we want. Right, so let's go into the UV editing workspace at the top. And just initially, I'm going to do it with a simpler object than the picture frame. So back into object mode, Shift A, and I'm going to put down a cylinder so we can do the same thing we did before. So move this across here, RY90. I'll just zoom out a bit. And at the moment, we don't have any material applied to this. Let's just go into material preview mode. So it's completely grey. What I'll do is I'll just add a quick new material. So over here, I'm going to click on new image. I'm going to choose UV grid, and then say OK. Zoom in a bit, and now I'll apply this image we've created to this cylinder. So let's bring up the shader editor. I'll just create a new material. We'll add Shift A, S, image texture, and I'll select that image we've just created. So untitled, plug this straight into the material output. And now we can see that on the cylinder. And you'll notice that it's actually already got a texture applied to it quite nicely. And this is because all of the objects that we create, if we go into object mode, Shift A, all of these objects in here have got UVs already set up for us. So I'm going to destroy the UVs it's already got by going into edit mode. So this is where you set up the UVs. and I'll just press U, make sure I've got all the faces selected, and pressing U will bring up this UV mapping window, which will give us the various methods of unwrapping the object. So I'm going to reset the UVs. I'm going to go into isolation mode, so we can only see the cylinder. And we'll start replicating what we did before in the example. So I'm going to select the end face and this end face. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to have to actually use the edge menu for this. So Control E, or choose the edge menu up here, and we'll choose Mark Seam. So any edges that are connected to this face, that are surrounding this face rather, will become red, indicating that we've marked those edges as a seam, and that will tell the UV unwrap function that we use that these pieces should be cut. And we'll do the same now for this edge. Go into edge mode, choose this one or this one. We'll right click and we'll say Mark Seam. We'll select everything and we'll press U, and then we'll say unwrap. And that's it. So we've now unwrapped it into three separate islands rather. One for both ends. So this one for one end, this for the other end, and then this one for the main part. And it's automatically made sure that the scale of these islands in the UV editor is proportional to the actual scale of the objects, the faces in the 3D viewport, so that the textures are all the same size across the different parts of the object. Now we've also got the option to unwrap individual parts without using seams, and that can result in the proportions being incorrect in the UV editor. So let's have a go at that. I'll just undo what we've already done. To this point here, we've now got no seams again on the object. We've got no UVs. Right. What we can do instead of marking the seams everywhere for the islands is actually select the islands individually, and we'll press U, unwrap. Now we've got two islands, and now we'll select this one. We'll press U and unwrap. Now I've got a bad result there because I didn't I didn't tell it where to cut. So I'll go into edge mode, choose this one, right click, mark seam, and this time I'm going to do face mode, L, and the F9 menu. I can now use the UVs to tell the select linked where the boundary of the selection should be. So with seams, it's going to select it all because we don't have any seams. With UVs, it's just going to select the UV island that's currently underneath the mouse when I press L. And now I'll do U, unwrap, and now we've got this over here. Now because we didn't unwrap it all at once, it's not orientated it or scaled it correctly in proportion to the other parts of the object that we've already unwrapped. The image here is a different angle, and the squares are also much bigger. So if I press A, the circles are much bigger than they should be. So this is where we select everything, and under UVs, we can now choose the most common options, which are average island scale. This is just going to make sure that when you click that, the scale of the individual islands in the UV editor will match the scale proportionately to what they are in the 3D editor, and now the squares are all the same size again. Now we've still got the issue of that diagonal piece, so we need to fix that. So what we can do at this point is go into UV menu, and we'll say pack islands. So we've already made them the right scale. What we need to do now is pack them. So I want them to be aligned for the rotation with an axis. So I want to make sure that each island is aligned to either the X or the Y. So it's either going horizontally or vertically. I don't want anything diagonal like that. So I change this to axis aligned, and then I'll choose OK, and it's going to pack those in for us, making sure that everything is aligned correctly. And it's a good idea, by the way, for any options that you use regularly inside of Blender, you've got the ability to right click on it and say add to quick favorites. So I'm going to add that one, and I'm going to add this one as well. And now if I want to do any of those operations, all I need to do is press Q to bring up the quick favorites menu, and I don't have to mess about going into the menus every time I need to do that operation. It's just going to be straight there for me. Right, so let's take a look at some of the other ways we can unwrap. So if we go into the unwrap menu again, so U, we've got things like project from view. So project from view is going to create a projection of the UVs based on the current view. So you can see that this perfectly emulates what we've got from the view over here. That's useful if you want to, say for example, paint an environment from a HDRI image based on the camera angle. And we'll be doing that later in actual fact. Next, we've got project from view bound. That's just going to do the same thing, but make sure it fills the bounds of the UV square. And then above this, we've got, it's similar to project from view, but it projects from faces of particular types of objects that are most suitable for the shape you've got. So if I do a cube projection, it's going to create like an imaginary cube around the object, and it's going to base the projection from each face, and then it will unwrap that cube to give us this result over here. And then we've got cylinder projection, and we can choose the options how we want to align that cylinder, that imaginary cylinder that it's projecting from, a number of ways. We can do it from the current view, either on the equator, or if we're looking at the end of the cylinder, we'd use view on poles, or we can align it to the object, where it's going to use the local coordinates. So the cylinder will be aligned, that imaginary cylinder. Just bring up the move option, go into object mode. We can see the gizmo reflecting the local orientation of that cylinder, and the imaginary cylinder will be aligned to that gizmo as well. So if you rotate the origin, then the imaginary cylinder will also be rotated, and you'll get a strange result. And next up, back into edit mode, we've got sphere projection, useful for spheres, and again we've got all the same sort of options we had before. So align it to object. We're going to get a spherical sort of result, which is quite similar actually to the cylinder one, but it's most useful if you've got a spherical object, obviously. And the ones above it, light map, this is one you use if you're going to send your object into a game engine and you want the individual faces. Let's just do it. We've now got an individual island for every face on the object. And that's fine because the game engine will be creating the texture based on the UVs. So the layout isn't really as important. Normally, when you do that, you would choose a bit of a bigger margin maybe, just so you don't get any light bleed across. You can see we've got little margins in between those islands. And the next one, Smart UV Project. Now this is like Unwrap. It will still use your seams if you've marked them, but it will also create additional seams on edges where the surrounding faces are above a certain angle. So let me show you what I mean. I'll just reset the UVs. And we'll do U, and we'll do Smart UV Project, and it's probably going to do a good job. What it's basically saying here is that any edge where the connected faces form an angle greater than 66 degrees, it's going to cut it automatically for us. It's going to mark it as a seam. So let's see how this works. We'll do OK. And I'll just do scale to bounds as well, so it automatically fits into the UV square. If we zoom out, it's done a pretty good job. But because we've used scale to bounds, it actually stretched those circles. So let's do that again. Smart UV Project, I'll turn off scale to bounds. And now we're going to keep the correct ratio. So it's not done a bad job, but unfortunately, it's not done as good of a job because with it creating its own cuts, if I just do L on here and make sure on the F9 menu I've got it set to UVs, you can see we've got a lot of different sort of UV islands over here. And this means that we're going to get more seams. So if we have a look at one of the seams, you can see there we've got a seam here. So I press L. It's not correctly aligned. And if we come down to the bottom, we've got another seam there. And it's just going to make it more likely you're going to get discontinuity along the objects where the textures don't quite line up correctly. You can, of course, try increasing that angle. So let me just do that again. Press A, do U, we'll say Smart UV Project, and I'll turn this up to the maximum 89 and choose OK. We're going to get a few less seams, but we're still not going to get a perfect result. And you can see here as well, we're starting to get stretching, which is probably going to be evident here. There you go. So we've got stretching along this one there. So you don't get the same amount of fine control. And even if you try changing these after the fact, so it's all interactive, by the way, you're probably not going to get as good of a result as if you do it manually. And all of these UV coordinates that we've created for this object will be stored in the UV maps. So we've basically got a UV map here, which stores the position of each of these vertices in its XY location on this 0 to 1 by 0 to 1 squared grid, the UV grid. And we can create multiple of these. So if you want to create multiple UVs for one object, then all you do is click plus, and then you've got a brand new UV grid, which will be a copy initially of this one. But if I now go in here and I'll do U unwrap, and we'll just make it something, I don't know, maybe a projection view. We can now flick between the two, and whichever one's got the camera is the one that will be used by default during rendering. But you can specify different ones within a shader just by dropping down. So Shift A S, a UV map node, and then you can specify which UV map you want to use for different textures. So you can see there, I've chosen the UV map, the first one. If we come out, we'll see that effect. But if I come into this texture now, and I'll change the UV map that's driving this image, by default it will use the active one, unless we specify differently. So if I specify the second one now, you'll see we're getting completely different UVs on there. So this is why you can have multiple UVs for a single object. Let's get rid of that one. And I'll just get rid of that as well. We'll delete this, and it will now default to whatever we've got set over here. Alright, so I'm going to get rid of this cylinder now. I'll just delete that. Before you move on though, I'd like to pause the video and try and unwrap 3 different objects. So the first object is going to be a cube, and that should be quite easy. And try and unwrap it in multiple ways. Don't just go with a cube project. Obviously that would be too easy. Try and do it with seams and without seams as well. And then we'll do another one, the cylinder, which should be easy because we've just done this one. Again, try and do it with the different methods. And then lastly, and this one's going to be a little bit tricky, try and unwrap a torus. Now for the torus, let me just give it a material. Use this material, and in actual fact, use this material on all 3 of those objects so you can check you've done it correctly. But again, this was by creating a new one over here and choosing generated type UV grid. And then in the material that you're going to be using, you need to assign that texture to be used either into the output, directly into the output, or into the base color of the principal BSDF. Once you've got that done, you need to make sure that the texture that we've got here is flowing perfectly with the geometry. And this is going to be quite difficult to do. I expect you should be able to unwrap it using seams, using the unwrap feature. But to get it flowing perfectly, that's going to be quite tricky. I'll give you a clue. You need to use follow active quads. But I've not yet told you how to use that. So see if you can work it out. If not, don't worry, and I'll catch you in a second.